Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast. As always, I am your host, Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, I have a great conversation with Heather Smith, who runs the Moxie School, which provides training for internal family systems therapists and also psychedelic-assisted therapy. And we actually had this conversation I think 4 months ago now. So I've been sitting on this interview for quite a while. It's a little bit overdue in getting it to you, but I had some other things that were more time pressing and relevant to get out first on the podcast. So this is just my apology to Heather for holding on to this for so long. Thank you for being patient, but here is our interview out on the podcast this week. But of course, first, let's just get a few quick announcements out of the way before we get into this week's interview and conversation. I would like to thank, I had a small PayPal contribution come in over this past week from Nicholas, who likes to make a small PayPal donation every once in a while. Thank you very much, Nicholas. I really appreciate your ongoing support. Whenever you feel like throwing a buck my way, it's always welcome. If you would like to support this podcast, which I encourage you to do if you enjoy this podcast and want to support the work that I've been doing here for the past 17 years and will be continuing to do as long as I have a listening audience. Really, the easiest way to do that is to head on over to my Patreon page, patreon.com/MartinWBall. There is everything from $1 a month all the way up to $100 a month. And if you just want to support the podcast, I recommend signing up at the $1 a month. Even better, sign up at the $5 a month. Even a little bit better than that is sign up at the $10 a month level. And know if you sign up at the $20 a month level and anything above that, you get access to the Entheogenic Evolution Archive, which has probably a couple hundred hours worth of talks and interviews that are just no longer available actively on the podcast and not available really anywhere else on the internet. You can only find it at the Entheogenic Evolution Archive at my Patreon page. So it's a great way to support this podcast and, of course, get something back in return. And for those of you who are looking for any kind of ongoing support or mentorship or ongoing reflection and integration help, my top 3 tiers earn you video call check-ins with me. At the STEM level, that earns you a 1-hour video call every 3 months. At the CAP level, that earns you a 30-minute video call once a month. And at the God Molecule level, that gets you a 1-hour monthly video call with me. Of course, there's no obligation. You can come and go as you like. You can change your support level at any time. And particularly at that $100 a month level, that's often used by people who want ongoing integration support, or also people who are facilitating or even offering integration services on their own and would like some ongoing reflection and support or mentorship at that level. So I encourage you to check it out. I always love getting new supporters over at Patreon. And for anybody who has ever supported me at Patreon, thank you very much. There tends to be a lot of turnover there, especially at the upper echelon, the top tiers, just because, it is a financial commitment. People come for the time period that they feel that they need help, and then when their situation changes or they feel that they don't need that support anymore, then they lower their support level or they cancel it entirely. It's all fine, but it's a great way for me to help support you and for you to support me in return. And of course, if you would just like to arrange a one-off 30, 60, or 90-minute video call with me to help you integrate your psychedelic experience or offer you some support or mentorship, you can just stop by at nondualentheogenicintegration.com. You can just shoot me an email at martinwball@gmail.com, and I'm always happy to set up a time to speak with you. And depending on where you are in the world, we will find a time that fits for both of us with our relative time zones. And I do work with international clientele, so I'm used to juggling kind of complex time zone differences. Again, just shoot me an email or stop by at nondualentheogenicintegration.com or martinball.net if you want more information. Lastly, just want to remind everyone that I am offering the next round of my 5-MeO DMT Integration Specialist training course with Mindscape Psychedelic Institute. The fall term of the class starts on September 17th. It meets for 9 weeks. I still have spaces available. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the course. You can go to mindscapeinstitute.org and just put in your name and email there to receive more information. You're welcome to ask me any questions that you might have about it. I'm also happy to share the syllabus of the course with you if you wanted to take a look at that before committing to the class. But I'm looking to get some more students for the class and would happy to have you there. It's about a month and a half out now, so there's still plenty of time for people to sign up. But of course, that is available. And one last thing I just wanted to mention is I actually got a sort of interesting request from a fellow in Switzerland the other day who said that he didn't want to join up at Audible, but he wanted all of my audiobooks, so we did a file transfer. But actually, I had not really had my audiobooks available for that in the sense of having all the audio files arranged that would be easy to transfer that way. But now that this fellow in Switzerland has done that, I've got that all set up. So if you'd like to buy an audiobook directly for me, we can do that via file transfer if you don't want to, sign up at Audible or Amazon or the Apple bookstore and, pay the monthly fee or whatever it is, however it is that they run that. But of course, I do have 14 audiobooks out there at Audible, Amazon, and the Apple bookstore. And of course, my books are also available in paperback and ebook. Okay, I think those are all the announcements that I have for today. Let's go ahead and get into this long overdue sharing of this conversation with Heather Smith from the Moxie School. That's Moxie School. You can find her online and get more information there. But here's our conversation, just all about her school and her entry into psychedelic therapy and internal family systems and how she sees those as working together and how she teaches those with her students. Please enjoy. I'll be back next week with the final installment of the audiobook of the novel, The Fate of Morani, for your listening enjoyment here on the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. All right, carry on. Have a good day. Okay, well, I am welcoming on to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast today, Heather Smith, who runs a school with a name that I like very much. It is the Moxie School. And even though it sounds the same, it's not named after my dog, Moxie, because it's spelled differently. But Heather, welcome to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, since I've already mentioned it, let's just start with the name, the Moxie School. And it's spelled Moxie. So, it's like the official word. So I'm assuming it's also not named after Moxie, Moxy, which is the nickname for 5-MeO, MIPT, methyl isol propyltryptamine, or tryptamine, excuse me. Mm-hmm. So how'd you choose the Moxie School as the name for your school, which we will be talking about?
Yeah, well, the short version of that story is I had a dream at one point about my grandfather reporting from essentially what I imagine is like the Akashic record. Like he was reporting to guides on all the people he knew back on Earth. And he got to me, and I was really excited in the dream as this like little 9-year-old. I think I was around that age when he passed. And I was like, what's he going to say about me? And he said, oh, she's smart and spunky. And I remember waking up from the dream feeling like, oh, that was so sweet to have that like connection with my granddad. I hadn't, really connected with him or thought about him in years. And then a couple weeks later, I was thinking about my name. And I've always felt like Heather was kind of feathery or light, or it didn't match me. And so I was doing this kind of deeper meditation and contemplation around my name. And this Moxie name came up, and I was like, Moxie? And it kind of felt like it came out of nowhere. It was one of these bottom-up moments. And I was like, what's Moxie? And I actually had to look it up because I was like, I think that's an old-fashioned word. And when I read the definition of Moxie, I was like, whoa, that felt energetically connected to the way I experienced what my grandfather said in Smart and Spunky, and just kind of a real effervescent sort of pizzazz, if we might. And so I held onto that word. It felt like it just held a lot of special meaning from that, meditation space that I had about my name. And then it felt so connected to the dream that I just held on to it until it felt like a right time to use it. So when my school needed a name, I was like, maybe that Moxie will fit for that.
All right. Well, I think it's a great name. My dog Moxie agrees. We spelled her name Moxi.
Cute.
But I love the word. I'm always excited when I see it somewhere. I think it was in Costa Rica, and there was like a drink. There was like the Moxie drink, and then I was somewhere else where there was like the Moxie Cafe. So I always get excited when I see it. Like, oh yeah, Moxie, because I love my dog. I talk about my dog a lot.
I love it. I love dogs too.
Yeah. So Heather, I'll just kind of share with the audience the way that this conversation came about is that I have a client who supports me over at Patreon, and we have monthly integration calls, and she's spoken about you a lot and talked about the Moxie School, and she's very into internal family systems therapy. And then I had recently done an interview with Ashley Booth, who has her new book about internal family systems therapy of quieting the storm within. And I had mentioned that to this client who's over at Patreon, and then she mentioned you again. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. Let's see if Heather wants to come on the podcast and talk about all of this. So it just felt very timely that it's been coming up a lot in conversations around IFS. So we'll get to that, and we'll get back to the school. But this is the point where I would just like to invite you to introduce yourself to the audience, and we'll share a little bit. The Moxie School is about internal family systems. Big surprise. I already mentioned that. But also specifically in conjunction with psychedelic therapy. So let's go ahead and get it into your background and how you got into this area. And then we'll be talking more about the school and the programs and how it all works together. How this chocolate and peanut butter come together for a super tasty flavor.
Love it. Well, the long and short of it is I asked this question one day when I was feeling a total imposter syndrome around being a private practice therapist. Like, how do people actually heal? How does transformation occur? And I felt like at that time in my career, I didn't have a good answer for that, but I wanted to know, like, how do I authentically, deeply help people? That's not just like talking about their problems all day long, or, like giving them these little tips and tools that like don't actually do anything. Like that just wasn't satisfactory for me. And so apparently when I asked this question out loud, how do people heal? It was all in retrospect that I realized all this came together. Pretty soon after, IFS just kept coming into my path. Like every colleague I talked with, they were all like, oh my God, have you heard of IFS? Blah, blah, blah. And this is back in like 2015. And so I was like, gee, I think I really need to check out this IFS thing. And as soon as I started getting into learning about IFS, I very quickly realized its power. I was like, oh, this therapy actually works. This feels really different from anything else I've been taught. Been through grad school, I've been, very much in the therapeutic field and hadn't found anything like this to date. And then as soon as I started getting into learning about IFS, Richard Schwartz talked about MAPS and the clinical trials that they were doing with MDMA. And for me, that was the first I ever learned about any sort of psychedelic therapy. And I was instantly completely like magnetized, like it grabbed me. And I was just like, oh my God, what is this? It sounded so powerful and so effective. And again, it was all on the heels of asking that question, like, how do people heal? And the research was showing like people were not qualifying for diagnoses of PTSD anymore. And I was like, how could that be possible? Like nothing else does that. And so it really got my attention. And one thing after another, eventually I continued my path with IFS big time, got more and more into the psychedelic world. And as I began working with clients who are also working with psychedelics, it was really interesting to see the comparison between people who had IFS and the psychedelic model together. I could see that their improvement seemed to be really deep, very thorough, and it felt like it was anchored in something that was like sustainable, that was long lasting. And then I'd watch other people who didn't have IFS and they were just, doing lots of ayahuasca, ceremonies or just repeat psychedelic experiences, but they weren't necessarily getting that anchored, lasting result. It was like they were having experiences, but they weren't necessarily knowing how to like integrate or unpack it all. And so eventually I received a vision for creating like a training wellness center where we're doing both training psychedelic therapists as well as doing the treatment there of helping people heal, psychological, if we want to call it psychological issues, through plant medicine, MDMA, et cetera. And so in my vision of getting to that bigger, actual institute that I'd love to create someday, actual physical building and place, retreat center types of place, I was curious and I asked myself, what are my half steps to getting there? Because that was a really big dream. And I felt led to start teaching online and that I could start doing this in a very economic way. And so that's how the Moxie School came about, was how can I start training people who are interested in working with psychedelic medicines? How can I train them IFS and get them exposure and access to this amazing model, who particularly a lot of the people in the psychedelic world wouldn't qualify to get into the regular IFS Institute trainings, because at this point, the IFS Institute primarily takes licensed therapists. And the majority of people working in psychedelics at this point are not necessarily therapists.
Right.
And so I welcome everybody else who's curious to learn IFS. So that's essentially the Moxie School.
Okay. So let me ask you a question on the academic side of things. So first I'll do a little sharing. So one of the things I've shared many times here on my podcast is that when I went through school, I got my degree in religious studies. Went on, I got my MA, my PhD. And for me, I had been interested in psychedelics since before I entered graduate school. And I had to kind of create my own curriculum around the study of entheogens and indigenous cultures and how these were used, and the impact on religion and religious practices. But it wasn't anything that was ever offered in terms of classes or education. Like I've mentioned this a few times, where I think out of all the different seminars that I had as a graduate student, there was one time where Amanita mushrooms was mentioned in the context of Taoism, and then I think maybe peyote was in one of the classes, talking about Native American church or something like that. But for the most part, it just wasn't there at all. Right. Now, I've been out of academics for quite a while now, so I don't know what current religious studies programs are incorporating. But we all know, those of us in the psychedelic world know that there's a long-standing history of psychedelics in religions and cultures around the world. So I'm curious for you, in having gone through official education around therapy, though I think you mentioned like 2015 was the year. Yeah. So that's sort of, the MAPS was around, but more and more we're seeing this idea of psychedelic therapy and the use of psychedelics in conjunction with different forms of psychotherapy and the treatment of addiction and PTSD, depression, all of that stuff. In going through school, were you exposed to any of that at the official class level, or is that all something that you had to learn like outside of your official training?
Yeah, the answer is 100% hell no. So a little bit more about my background is that I was raised as a conservative Christian. And so all of my undergraduate and graduate schooling was in Christian schools that would have been very, very, very opposed to any sort of psychedelic use. And so, part of this emergence for me is that really like shedding my Christian upbringing and kind of the burden I felt around, just a lot of things that I was taught about drugs and, all sorts of things that this religion brought, and moving into a more open, curious, spacious place of actually having the accessibility to even be curious about the psychedelic therapy was like a huge step for me from where I had come from. And so my education definitely did not address this type of thing at all. And I appreciate what you just said about you had to kind of essentially create your own curriculum. And I very much feel like that is sort of the path I've been on, because when I was just on the cusp of psychedelic therapy and all these training programs coming out, Psychedelics Today has something, Synthesis has programs, IPI, all these programs are out now, but they did not exist when I first started. And in fact, the only program I could find back then was Daniel McQueen out of Colorado. And I Googled, and it was like the one and only psychedelic training program I could find back then with cannabis. And so, yeah, it's really been kind of a path of self-teaching and discovery and exploration. So I hear you on that.
Yeah. So for regular listeners, there is an interview with Daniel McQueen. This is further back in the podcast registry there. So yeah, you're kind of one of the new generation, one of the new crop in a sense. You know, like as we were just discussing, I've been into psychedelics since my first exposure to psychedelic mushrooms is I was like 17 or 18 years old, and my first exposure to cannabis was when I was 15, and I was just like, oh, this is interesting. This is really, really interesting. And then when I got to psychedelic mushrooms, like, whoa, this is really, really interesting. So it's been a big part of my life for a long time. So I'm kind of old school in that sense.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of more in the camp that I always talk about as kind of this new demographic where we have people who maybe have been trained in various professions, people leading very professional lives, but have had their eyes open to psychedelics. So they're not coming from that cultural background in any way, but have kind of come into the field because you see the efficacy of it.
Right. Yeah.
So in that transition from that Christian background, formal therapist training background, I'm just curious if there's anything you would want to or be open to sharing with the audience about your own personal entry. Like how did that happen? Because it's a big leap for people. This idea of when did you take your first psychedelic, and when did that start to shift your worldview? And because you haven't said this, but I'm going to imagine that maybe that prior Christian identity has shifted now. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So anything you'd want to share there?
Yeah, sure. So in my mid-20s, I became very disenchanted with the Christian faith. And it's really when I just kind of found myself done through a series of events that I felt really heartbroken by. And so I kind of entered like a 10-year phase of sort of an agnostic, sort of just nothingness land of like no spirituality. It was just kind of, I switched off that switch, and I was just kind of going through life. And then it was through that 10-year phase when I began learning about IFS. Maybe it was more than 10 years at that point, but I would say that was my first step in beginning to shift that worldview. Because all of a sudden I was able to begin to know myself in a new way and recognize where some of these different things that I felt shame or guilt or a narrow-mindedness, and I could begin to see where these different parts of myself learned those things, or where I was still holding some of that from the past. And I was able to start shedding that, and it really began to open me. I would say open my heart, right? And so, like I kind of just referenced it a couple moments ago, when I was introduced to this idea of psychedelic therapy, there was an opening there that had never been there before. And I really grant my own personal process of beginning to work with my own personal parts that was giving me that accessibility to get curious about the psychedelic medicines. And so that was worldview changing for me in and of itself. And then once I started learning about MDMA, I was so intrigued. I literally like voraciously read everything I could get my hands on. I think I watched everything that existed on YouTube at the time. And I was just so fascinated and so curious, so interested in doing this, that I was like, I have to figure out a way to do this. And I had no contacts in my life. Like I didn't come from a culture of, smoking cannabis or knowing people who would sell these things, or, like I was like, how am I ever going to get contact? So in my savvy little ways, I figured out different places I could attend, different events and that sort of thing that were psychedelic related. And I was like, you know what, maybe I'll just start going to a few of these different events. And of course, one thing led to another, where I was actually able to meet a facilitator who had been working in the field for kind of the old school folks, who've been doing this for many, many years. And I was able to do a consultation and meet with this person who'd been sitting for people one-on-one doing MDMA for many, many years. And so that was my opening to be able to have my first kind of official guided journey. And it was absolutely amazing. And I came out of that journey, I think like many people, feeling like, oh my gosh, if everybody in the world had access to this, it really had the potential to change things, you know? And I recognize that's a little bit of a panacea belief. And there's so much more beyond. I mean, there's still a lot of work to do, like once you use these medicines, but that's the way I came out of it. And I also felt this really deep conviction that there's a big difference between it being illegal and the ethic behind it. And I felt like, how can I know about something that is so good and so helpful for people and not share it? That to me felt unethical. And so I was struck with this dilemma between legality and my ethic of feeling like, how can I not share this? And that's what eventually kind of led me to keep pursuing it and moving forward with exploring it for myself and training other people in psychedelic IFS. Because it just felt like there's no way I can't not share this. So
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I just want to just kind of reaffirm that sense that, especially when somebody maybe later in life comes into their first psychedelic experience, there's someone who doesn't have a background in that area and discovers like, wow, this is a really impactful experience. And I think that it's very natural to have that sense of, wow, this could change the world. And yeah, it's a little naive because, you know, as we know, as you do more work, you realize, wow, this is kind of hard. There's a lot of unpacking to do. There's a lot of reformatting, and it's not going to magically solve our problems.
Yeah, exactly.
But it does provide an entryway into a level of experience that most of us has never had before. And that's invigorating as a human being to have discovered this for ourselves. And I think there's that natural impulse of, wow, I want to share this. I want to share information about this. I want to make this accessible for people. And I think it's just a big part of, it's almost a kind of conversion experience in a sense, where now you've been exposed to something and it just opens a whole new view on what's possible. So
absolutely. Yeah.
It's natural to go through that. And I think a lot of people do go through sort of an evangelical stage, and it's usually a little bit overstated. You know, I mainly work in the world of 5-MeO DMT, and that's a big one where people are like, wow, everybody's got to do this. And that was certainly my first impression. And then, you know, I work with a lot of clients for their integration, and a common experience that happens is people go through something really beautiful with 5-MeO, and then they get to something that's really, really hard. And then they say, I don't know if I should have told everybody about this because, wow, I mean, that was, well, you know, it's a part of the process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So in doing this kind of training, I mean, obviously we're not at the point yet where we really do have psychedelic therapy. So it's, I mean, other than underground, certainly there's a lot of people practicing underground. There's a lot of people practicing unofficially in a way that actually there's a lot of psychedelic therapy that's being offered for, say, veterans in the United States right now. Some of it is through the somewhat minor legal protection of entheogenic churches, which have different criteria and different standards than therapists. So with the Moxie School, essentially it seems like offering trainings, and I do this also with the Mindscape Psychedelic Institute. We offer training, but it's not like you can just go set up shop. So this is sort of more preparatory for as things shift, or as you potentially move to a different country where the legal restrictions are not as draconian, maybe you could do this. Or if you want to go underground, you know, of course, that's not anything that we would ever promote at our school. And I would imagine at your school, you would not promote that as well, to just work underground. But in terms of taking that step of making this available, how did you envision that this would then contribute, like as we've talked about, that there's not a lot of official programs for psychedelic therapy, and then bringing in the IFS components. So, what's the plan with training people through these kinds of programs at Moxie School?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I got involved with MAPS Expanded Access back in 2019 and actually initiated an expanded access site with the hope to become a MAPS trained therapist and, do that whole official route. And pretty quickly I was like, I keep seeing the writing on the wall that this is going to take a lot longer. Like, even back then it was getting delayed. Right? We thought MDMA was going to be rescheduled 2019, 2020, then COVID hits. And I eventually decided, I don't think I'm going to stick around waiting for this. And I kind of, shifted gears and didn't continue with that MAP site. And then last year when it didn't, again, we were the huge promises, huge expectation that MDMA was going to get rescheduled. And it didn't. It was like, whoa, like so many people were anticipating that. And I think my original hope and plan was that with the rescheduling of MDMA, there would be a bunch of, new sites where people were able to have clinics and retreat centers and do all this in a very open, legal, safe way. And it actually gave me a lot of question of like, geez, I wonder if people are going to still come and want to learn this in light of believing that we're going to have big shifts and changes coming. So ultimately I've continued because, like you named, I have a lot of students who are working for entheogenic churches and under that sort of cap. Lots of people are going to Peru and Brazil and all over the place to do their ayahuasca. And so it feels like, people have plenty of alternative ways that they're still exploring and doing this work, coaches, et cetera. So for me, I'm just really focused on the IFS aspect of it. And it feels like for me, regardless if people are actually working with medicine or not, as they also learn the IFS piece, that ultimately the IFS in and of itself could be really helpful and beneficial for people to learn. And I also find sometimes people just take my class for their own personal benefit. Then not everybody who's in my school is actually doing any sort of additional facilitation or work with plant medicine. So it's quite a big spread of who I'm seeing.
Yeah. So maybe we could take a minute just for anybody who's listening who maybe is out of the loop on this with MAPS, Lycos, the MDMA attempt at rescheduling and opening up the therapy. And obviously you've been involved through MAPS. So I would like to invite you just to tell us a little bit more about what happened, what the expectation was, and then what actually happened as this was going through the process and kind of where we're at now. And it's not like you need to speak for MAPS or Lycos or anything but about that. But just it seems like you have more of an inside perspective on this. So I thought it would be interesting if we could just touch on this a little bit.
Yeah, I'll speak to it as well as I can. And I'm certainly not in any sort of inner circle by any means in terms of knowing. A little part of me is nervous of misspeaking, so I just want to kind of name that.
Okay.
I want to be careful with my words to do it well. But what I understand is that that if MAPS could get clinical trials to show the efficacy, to show that they could statistically prove or show that they could reduce, this PTSD in veterans, et cetera, people with treatment-resistant trauma, if they could reliably show that through these research trials, that it was actually by law that the FDA would have to reschedule it if it was statistically shown. And I believe what turned out is that they were able to actually give the numbers and the research to the FDA to show that it was statistically significant. In the end, when it went for rescheduling this past year, I believe what happened was, what I've heard is that they essentially were given a panel of reviewers from the FDA who had no familiarity with this research trial. And MAPS had been working with the FDA for years. I mean, I think close to 20 years almost. And so they were before a panel of people who completely did not get or understand anything around the protocol. And So essentially, the rescheduling got completely shut down. Like, I think only 2 out of however many people are on the panel actually voted for it. And it was just this huge devastation because everybody in the community was expecting it to be rescheduled according to the protocol. And the other interesting thing about all this is that the FDA actually helped MAPS create the research protocol because it was such a different kind of study, right? What made it complex and different from any other study that ever come through the FDA before was it wasn't just researching a specific medication or a therapy. It was a combination of the two. It was working with MDMA with therapy, right? So they were including 12 therapy sessions and 3 MDMA sessions for the total outcome of what they were researching. And never had the FDA ever worked with these 2 different types of components. And so they just didn't have any sort of protocol or like, how do we do this? How do we show that it's safe? So that's why MAPS worked so closely with the FDA. They actually co-partnered over all these previous years to figure out how do we do this. And then in the end, the FDA turned it down, which is like, what the hell? After all that work and collaboration, it was really surprising, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah. And it really seems like a bad faith effort on the part of the government where, as you say, it was kind of created in collaboration. And then I think part of the discourse around it was, well, but we don't know about this therapy part. And we just want to know, like, what does the molecule do? It's interesting. I actually had a conversation the other day with a researcher in Europe who's doing clinical trials with 5-MeO-DMT, and we were kind of talking about this question of whether there should be some kind of integration in therapy combined with that, or how it might that problematize the study in potential ways. Like, I think this is what happened in part with the MDMA trials, is that then they kind of said, well, what about this therapy aspect of it?
Mm-hmm.
But then they're not even learning about what was created. So that's where it just comes off as bad faith. And I know this is a totally separate issue, but it just makes me think of how I read the other day that apparently some female senator was defending Trump's renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America by saying, well, Mexico's been dumping wastewater into the coast off of San Diego for decades, so they haven't been taking care of the water, and that's why we're justified renaming it. And like everybody had to point out, that's not even the same body of water. But that's what I mean by it's like bad faith, that they're coming in without even having bothered to learn about what they're really there to be evaluating. And that's super frustrating.
Yeah, incredibly disappointing. Yeah, I think if any one of those people had truly understood what MDMA is and the power of it, there would have been a very different outcome.
Yeah, and maybe, hey, let's give it a try.
Seriously.
That'd be interesting to anybody who's on the panel. Like, well, come try the therapy and see how you feel.
Yeah, let's do a peer review.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about IFS. So for my regular listeners, this was just a couple conversations ago with Ashley Booth talking about IFS, and her book is not about IFS in conjunction with psychedelic therapy, but she also has gone through MAPS. She's trained as a psychedelic therapist. She works with ketamine. So we were able to open up the conversation around that. You have your little Venn diagram. I have your website right here. You have IFS in a triangle. You have psychedelic assisted therapy in a circle, and then they go together. But let's start with just talking a little bit more about IFS. And I'm sure that many people in the psychedelic world are at least vaguely familiar with this. It's something that comes up more and more in my integration consultations with clients, where they are bringing in their own language around IFS, talking about their psychedelic experiences, and in particular talking about different insights and breakthroughs and realizations that they're having afterwards. They're using the language of, I'm blended with this part, and then I wanted to decouple from it. So I'm hearing and seeing it a lot. So let's get into a little bit about what more of what it is, and we can just assume that people haven't listened to the interview with Ashley Booth.
Yeah, perfect. Maybe I'll add or supplement for her.
Yeah.
So IFS is essentially a method, a model, a template for turning inward and really getting a cartography, a map of the inner world of like who or what lives inside of me in terms of these parts. And we might talk about them as aspects of ourselves or these little sub-personalities that kind of embody different experiences of ourselves, whether it's ways in which we react with anger, or we succumb to deep depression, or maybe we have methods for avoiding things and just pretending they don't exist. Whatever those different kind of strategies that we have, we would call those parts. And so IFS provides really this ability for us to get curious about what kind of parts do we have, and then also how do we navigate or approach them. So not just the fact that we've got some parts, but like what's the method of getting to know those parts, exploring why they're there, what kind of a positive intentions they may have had for us, how do they believe they're protecting us, or how do they hold any like deep wounding that maybe we've experienced way back in time, and somehow that's still kind of like seared away in our soul. We're still carrying some of this stuff from maybe childhood, et cetera. Like it could be trauma or just deep, painful wounding. And so IFS gives us this model for approaching those different parts with what we call self-energy, which is this compassionate, curious, open way to essentially, I find the first step is to really seek to understand, like to really understand these different parts of ourselves. And as we more deeply understand them, we often move into this wow, aha moment where I believe some awe kind of comes in through our system, and we feel this realization of like, oh, that's why this part of me has always been that way. That's why my anger has been so intense. Or, this is why I drink or drug or have some sort of addiction or something like that. Now it makes sense to me that this is what that was actually trying to do or function, right? And so as we move into those different compassionate awe states for these aspects of ourselves, we actually found that we can start to offer an alternative way for these parts to be in us. So maybe instead of going to such impulsive or reactive or addictive cycles, we can start to invite them, like, what if we could heal these original wounds that all these strategies are reacting to, and we could do life in some other way, right, than all these old ways we've always done it. So it really offers this hope for a new experience of how we're living our lives, feeling, within ourselves independently, but also how we relate and connect with other people in relationship.
So this obviously is something that we could talk about. We can go into therapy and we could talk about these different parts. So you had mentioned earlier that when you came across IFS, and seeing the results of it, that you perceived it as being much more efficacious than like the standard talk therapy. So how does it go about doing the process? How is that different from standard talk therapy? Because I think maybe a lot of people think about, people have talked about their inner child for years, right? Like, my inner child, this or that. And so this is kind of like IFS, but
right.
How is it different? How are people able to access these things in a way that's meaningful and produces change that is more thorough than just, I want to talk about my anger, I want to talk about my issues?
Yeah, I love your question. And I'm loving a phrase you keep saying is talk about. That's a huge difference in IFS, is we're not talking about it anymore. Like, we've done enough talking about it. It doesn't help. And that's old school talk therapy, is just talking about stuff, right? And it's been ineffective. Yeah. And so we've got to move from talking about stuff to actually getting into relationship with it and having an experiential, energetic, occasion. And I think this is where IFS and psychedelics get along so well, is it's incredibly experiential. You can feel it, you can sense it, you embody it, you feel the energy moving through you. Everything comes alive and it's so real. It's like you're living in it, right? A lot of times people in psychedelic states say whatever they experience is realer than real. And that's how it is with IFS also. So instead of talking about our parts, we actually have this process of what we call going inside. A lot of times, if you ever see like a demonstration of IFS being done, people will close their eyes and go inside, and they essentially are coming into contact with their imaginal realm to help them kind of see images or sensations of these parts of themselves. And the IFS therapist or facilitator will guide the client through actually making contact with these parts. And we literally can hear what they say, watch their behavior, see them in a scene from the past where maybe they originally started being this way or doing this job. And it is like there's a two-way conversation. Like we can ask them questions and they can respond. And honestly, that's a little bit psychedelic. So having that level of direct access to these parts provides essentially what happens ultimately in IFS is there's very big energetic releases that can occur for trapped energy or beliefs, burdens that we've held that these parts can have. And it's very shamanic. Part of what is not always advertised about IFS is that a lot of the work that we do with what we call exile parts, the parts that hold the pain and the burdens, that whole process of working with exiles was informed by Sandra Ingerman, who is a shamanic practitioner. And so IFS has a lot of shamanic practices built in it, but it's kind of cloaked in these Western clothes that looks really like clinical, but inside it's extremely psycho-spiritual. So, yeah, that's essentially the transformational process is that direct contact.
Okay, so it sounds a little bit like what in academics and also sort of New Age is often called like core shamanism. And there are critiques at the academic level of whether it's a construct or whether there really is such a thing as core shamanism. But we don't need to deal with that at the moment. And this is just my religious studies background. But there is a common theme of the idea of soul retrieval. And this is something that comes up in various shamanic contexts and cultures with this idea that you have lost part of yourself. Mm-hmm. And that part of yourself needs to be retrieved and then reintegrated. And so that shamanic model is that then the shaman travels in spirit form to find this lost part and to bring it back in and then reintegrates it with you, and that produces greater psychological, emotional, and physical health. So it sounds like what you're saying is that this IFS model follows this similar kind of modality through these rather psychedelic shamanic states of experiential dialogue within the person. So it's not necessarily the shaman that's finding the part, but it's actually the person themselves that is finding, oh, I've found this lost part of myself that has been neglected and maybe is acting out unconsciously. And now I'm integrating it into my consciousness so that it's a part of myself, but I'm no longer giving it the power to either abandon myself or to unconsciously take over, right? Mm-hmm. Like when we get into people saying, oh, I don't know why I get so angry, right? That's a part of the self that is bringing out this protective mode and that is creating this energetic signature that only knows how to react in this particular kind of way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And very much like what you're saying, it's as if we in this process of doing IFS are kind of that inner shaman, so to say, that we're going out and we are finding these parts have been exiled, they've been lost, deep in the subconscious realms. We don't even realize we're holding this kind of material in us until we really, start to get curious. And that's one of the tenets of IFS is to restore harmony and balance. And so as these parts are essentially brought back home to you and yourself, it's like they're restored, they're renewed, they release all those burdens and all that energetic trash that they've been stuck with. And as they're kind of reharmonized with you, it's like they reintegrate. And the beautiful thing is, as those young parts of us come back, essentially I say come back home to self, you feel that in your present life. Like I've noticed with all the deep work I've done with this, I've become more playful, more confident, just like deeply authentic in a way that I wasn't, 15 years ago. The Heather then and the Heather now is a really kind of different experience of a person. Yeah. And I really believe it's because all these exiles have been able to be essentially redeemed. And it's brought me into more of a more whole person. I mean, I've still got some work to do, but like it's happening, right? And it's really cool to feel the difference of myself in that kind of energy.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about energy. This is something that I talk a lot about in my books and my own approach. I always like to refer to psychedelics as ultimately I say, look, they're just energetic amplifiers. And that really, for me, what's most interesting in psychedelic states is the energy of what is taking place, what is transforming, what is expressing, what is it bringing out within the person. So I tend to stay away from metaphysics and overly spiritualizing things that I'm interested in. Like, what's the energy? So this is something that you've mentioned several times in conjunction with IFS is these energetic processes and releases and finding things that have been stored or suppressed. So I just invite you to expand on that a little bit more. And because this is an area where I do find a lot of people, especially in the spiritual world, have a lot of beliefs around energy. And so sometimes it can get kind of muddy when we start talking about energy and then people want to jump to kind of extreme metaphysics at times versus I always like to bring it back to, look, well, we are embodied beings of energy. Like me talking right now, that's energy. You describing yourself as being more playful, that's energy. We're not talking about something fluffy. We're talking about the actual lived experience of being a human
Yeah.
being in reality. So, yeah,
Right, right.
whatever you'd want to contribute there.
Sure. So first I'll say it's so interesting because when I was in my IFS level 1 training back, I think I started in 2018. I remember specifically asking my lead trainer, do we ever talk about energy in IFS? Because to me, I was already tuning into it as like, this feels very energetic to me. And I was also new to this idea of things being energy. And the lead trainer said, oh, no, 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 we don't talk about energy in IFS. And I was kind of taken back, like, oh, okay. Sit back down in my seat. And so that was a funny response. So what I want to say first and foremost is when I talk about IFS being energetic, it really is my own experience of it. That's more of a Heatherism than maybe what you might learn officially from the IFS Institute. But in my experience of working with my parts and being in my own expanded states, et cetera, and working with clients, I really sense that it is about energy. It's the energy that we hold. And sometimes I even describe this to students that when these wounded parts of us, these young exiled parts, it is as if lightning is striking the sand and creating glass. And it's like that for these young parts where all of a sudden we're struck with some sort of emotional experience at a young age, maybe we're 3, 4, 5 years old, and it comes out of left field. We're these little innocent beings just wobbling along earth, and all of a sudden this thing happens and we're like, poof. And that striking like glass is kind of like it takes form inside of our psyche. It's like it anchors into us in this way that we never forget. Like, oh, that's how you get shamed, or that wasn't okay, or that's where my play got shut down, or something like that, right? Like in that moment. And so I have no scientific proof for this, but it's just kind of my way of metaphorically speaking about it. And specifically when you go through the IFS process and do an unburdening, where the exile actually releases that original time when that lightning struck, whatever that occasion was, it feels very energetically in the body. And not just for me, like across the board, for anybody who's ever experienced an unburdening, there is literally your breathing will change, your body relaxes, your whole system gets calm, everything slows down. And as that young part transforms and releases and receives this unburdening, it will take on a whole new form all of a sudden. It'll go from being this super sad, lonely little independent part of you to this like dancing, smiling, confident little being within you within like 10 minutes. This process can happen really quickly once you're in the space to be able to do it. So to me, that's all energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know why they don't talk about energy, but I talk about energy.
Well, I think it's great because I think it makes things very direct. And once we reorient people around what they think of as energy, because a lot of people think like, oh, well, I'm like sending energy to you and these crystals are doing that and that's pulling down from these astral realms or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's a big metaphysical view of energy versus when we talk about how are emotions and thoughts being processed and also embodied and then physically represented in how we experience ourselves and how we embody and express ourselves. Like that's just, for me, that's what we're talking about with energy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it just made me think, and pulled this up so I could get her name right. But last night, my wife and I watched episode 1 of season 2 of Poker Face with Natasha Lyonne. And I just want to give this out as an example of, like, for anybody who's still thinking like, well, what do they mean by energy and how it's embodied and expressed? That in episode 1 of this television show, it's on Peacock. So if you don't have Peacock, I don't know if you can watch it. But anyway, it has Cynthia Erivo, who she played the Wicked Witch in Wicked. And in this first episode of Poker Face, season 2, she plays 5 different characters that they're what would that be? Centuplets, right? There's 5 of them, and so they're all sisters, and she plays each one so completely differently from the other. And then there's even a couple places where she is playing, one of the sisters is playing another one of the sisters, pretending to be another one of the sisters. So we get these multiple levels. And for me, this is kind of what I think about in terms of this idea of these different energetic signatures of these different parts of the self, that they, as we're watching her in this show, it's hard to believe it's the same actress, because she's so totally different, and the way she speaks is different, the way she embodies herself, the way she moves, the language that she uses, the expressions, her tone of voice, even her accent is totally different. It's like, but it's all one person displaying all these different things and having different emotional reactions to the same input. And that's, for me, that's what I mean when I'm talking about energy, and that sounds like what you're talking about when you're mentioning this idea of energy and how it presents in the person.
Yeah. I mean, any of us, our energy fluctuates all the time, right? Like you might feel really having fun with a friend, laughing, bubbly, and that kind of energy is high, right?
Yeah.
Versus, we just had a death in the family and you're feeling so low and grief is coming through and you might be tearful and crying. And that's a very different energy, right? I mean, to me, that just feels really obvious and simplistic. Like we're all experiencing different. I woke up this morning, I was really tired. That's a different energy, right? So I don't think that we need to get like, kind of like, I don't know, just keep it simple, right? Like, of course, like it's kind of obvious.
Yeah. And then how, like you were saying, you might be with a friend and everything is going great, but then a phone call comes in and then that triggers that wounded part of yourself, and then the energy shifts. Right?
Absolutely.
And your embodiment shifts, your facial expression shifts, and now you're not feeling bubbly fun anymore.
Exactly.
It's like, oh, this old trauma is coming up, right? So hopefully this is relatable for people. And this also is where I think it can be very relatable to psychedelic experience, where we go through a lot of different stuff as we move through our psychedelic experience. And we feel these energies in our bodies, and it's impacting our emotions, it's impacting our thoughts, and how we are expressing ourselves through that.
Absolutely.
So now let's talk about the psychedelic therapy component. Do you see IFS as something that we can enact in psychedelic therapy, or is it an adjunct of psychedelic? So we have the Venn diagram, right, of the triangle and the circle. What is the intersection? And do we work with them separately? Do we work with them together? How is this addressed, like within the school?
Yeah. So I believe there's so many possible models of how this can be done. And I think there's a lot of opinions in the world about, the right and wrong way to approach psychedelics. I know from some folks, they think that, once you take a psychedelic, you should not interfere, you should not intervene, you should do very little and really like remove any sort of interventions, etc. But I've found that at a certain point, specifically working with MDMA, there is a certain point where IFS can be used. And I think they're finding this with ketamine as well, where you can use IFS during the medicine in a way in which you're deferring to the medicine experience. The expanded state is having the front seat. It's in the driver's seat. We're deferring to the medicine and allowing that person in the medicine to go wherever they need to go, right? we're deferring to that. But as kind of a way to help deepen and expand and support whatever's happening organically with the medicine experience, IFS can come in and help, essentially what I refer to as like it kind of be a doula to further support the natural organic process that's already happening. So if somebody's coming to work with psychedelics with the intent of, I really want to heal some sort of childhood trauma or some sort of pattern or this experience I keep having that I just can't handle it anymore, right? People come kind of, a lot of times when people approach psychedelic therapy, they're coming because everything else has failed them.
Right.
And they're looking for one last straw, like, could this help me? And so when people come in with the intent like that, I believe you can use IFS in the psychedelic state to really support a person to get to that really deep granular space and really differentiate what's happening for them so that they can receive that clarity of how can I proceed and continue to work out whatever this is, whatever's been amplified to me, whatever's been shown in the psychedelic state, you can continue to work with that in integration. But IFS has a profound ability to expand an expanded state even more, which you would think psychedelics don't need any help because they're already so expansive and, surgical. But it's really phenomenal when you play with it, when you explore it a little bit, it can be really, really amazing.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's a tool that can be applied in the state itself and work with, and then continue to follow up through the ongoing therapeutic process.
That's right. So it can be a couple ways I could speak for it. It can be used in psychedelic state. I would say one caveat to that is you really don't want to do that unless you're super well trained. And so I wouldn't recommend just anybody who kind of thinks they knew a little bit about parts work try to do that. I think that if you're going to do that type of facilitation, you need to be very expert in that realm. And I think a lot of people, I'm just going to be really honest here, I think a lot of people think they know IFS and they don't. And that's a little bit scary. So I just want to put that little warning out to the audience of like, just use some due diligence around who you're working with and are they really deeply knowledgeable in this kind of way of working? Because we don't want to cause more harm and kind of facilitate in ways that are not helpful to people. However, I can also say that IFS is incredibly valuable for preparation. A lot of times people ask me like, well, how do you integrate? And I'm like, well, how'd you prepare? Let's focus more on prep, right? Because what happens in prep when people are doing parts work is they're beginning to learn more about how to go inside and navigate themselves and the type of material they find when they do go inside. And this is the same type of material we find on lower dose psycholytic levels of psychedelics. It essentially, when we do IFS and prep, it's kind of like a mini window into what we might find when we do the psychedelic.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a dress rehearsal to the big show, right? Yeah. And so a couple things happen in that prep space. One, to include helping people learn how to approach that material from a curious place. Instead of, like, a lot of people are inherently wired to run away from scary stuff. Or if really painful, difficult things come up, they want to avoid it and just like, I'm out, right? And people can do that on psychedelics. They don't necessarily lose all ability to avoid stuff. And we see people do that all the time. We have resistance. We won't let go. We, see some scary thing and we just turn away. And so IFS helps train people to make a 180-degree shift, right? It's almost like a complete paradigm shift. Instead of running away and avoiding it and doing everything you've already done your whole entire life, it's not worked. Let's try this completely opposite way. Let me help train you how to do that so that when you go in and use a psychedelic, you can actually have a new experience and see what it wants to show you, right? So prep with IFS is really, really powerful. And then once people know how to work in this method, they can keep using it in integration as well. So
yeah, so maybe to oversimplify, this is like the case of somebody encountering a demon in their psychedelic experience and like, oh, fuck, I got to get the hell out of here. Let's get away from this. Versus this is something that I like to encourage with people. It's like, well, just ask it why it's there, who it is, and what is it about? Like, engage with it. And that opens the potential to actually shift whatever that is representing for you.
Exactly. And, lots of people have talked about that in books they've written and this sort of thing. If you see a lion, move towards it. And my question is a bit like, but how?
Yeah. Okay.
Like when you're struck with fear, how
Right.
do you move towards something that is terrifying you? And so I like to work in that little bit more nuanced, nitty gritty space of the how to turn towards something that feels terrifying. And that's a lot of what we end up learning and practicing in IFS.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that you've mentioned that perhaps some people think that they understand IFS more than they really do. And I think that this is kind of it's a broad issue that's happening in culture right now as more people are exposed to various forms of therapy. They've received therapy. There's lots of books on therapy and self-help and all of that, which I think is great, right? It gives us a language, it gives us tools, but it can also create the idea of, well, I read about it, so I know it, or I had this done to me, therefore I know it, and that therapy speak is kind of invaded ordinary discourse where people, they want to talk about their triggers, they want to talk about their wounds, they want to talk about their parts, and it might create the illusion of competence where maybe there isn't necessarily. And especially, I think we have a really strong theme in American culture right now. Don't want to get too political, but we've got this theme of all you need is common sense. It doesn't matter what your official training is, and that we even have this suspicion of people who have, I've earned my PhD, I've earned my MD, I've been certified, and then you're held as suspect. Like, no, well, my common sense tells me I know better than you. And I think it's a really dangerous theme that's happening within culture right now. And I do think that we do see this in the psychedelic space where people, they've been served something and then they think, oh, I know how to do this. Or they've been treated with IFS and suddenly they think they're an expert on it. And so it's this weird balance where like offering these training programs and trying to educate people, but maybe it's not the full certified program. So it's developing knowledge. Like this is something that comes up. You mentioned I teach with Mindscape Psychedelic Institute, and I'm always telling the students, I encourage you to become aware of IFS and somatic therapy and EMDR and all the rest of this stuff. But I also tell them, don't you dare go trying to practice any of this stuff because you're not qualified.
That's right. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I even tell the students who come through my program, you have to keep learning. Like, I'm going to introduce you to this. I'm going to inform you. I'm going to teach you the technicalities of it all. But you don't really know this deeply until you've done it on yourself a lot, right? Like you really need to submit yourself to your own personal work. If IFS is your thing, like do your own personal IFS therapy regularly for years, please. And as you are the client, as you put yourself in the client's shoes and you experience it for yourself, that teaches you all these nuances of how parts come through. It teaches you so much just to be in it, right? To experience it. And I had a conversation with my own therapist recently, and we were talking about this idea that IFS is really should be taught as a mentorship. It's not just a level 1. It's not just a level 2. It's not just getting certified. It's a development over time. That's both a personal process that also becomes a professional process. And, so I'd encourage you, if you're working with somebody who says they're IFS, say, okay, how many years have you done your IFS therapy for? Not that that's a requirement, but I think it says a lot, honestly. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So let's talk about the classes and what you are. We've talked a lot about it, but let's get more specific about what you're offering at Moxie School, what the programs are, how people participate, and all of those details.
Yeah. So thank you for asking. I actually have a level 1 equivalent course. It's similar to the level 1 that the IFS Institute provides, and essentially teaching all the basics around the different types of parts, how they interact, how we approach them, the concept of self, all this type of stuff. And that's really a foundational course to give people all the nuts and bolts of what is IFS and how to begin doing it. And in that class, not only teach live every week with the students coming live online, but we also hold these small groups with, I have triads where 3 students at a time come in to do practice, and we meet every single week for an hour and a half. And I do live coaching with them, training them in doing the IFS live with each other. So it's super rich. I took that directly from the IFS Institute. That's also how they train. And it's one of the things that makes the Institute such a good training is that you get such good practice. And that stands out from a lot of other training programs where you have an actual person who knows the model sitting with you doing it. You're not just setting all the students off on their own to kind of experiment and see what happens. So people are getting like live feedback on how to do the model. So that's the level one, essentially equivalent that I do. It's called the Art of Transformation. And then after that, I have another course called, it's a workshop at this point. It's called the Art of Guiding. And that gets a lot more into the specifics of how we integrate IFS with expanded states. And so in that class, we talk about specific ways we use IFS for doing preparation, looking at like what's actually happening in the prep process to help clients be ready to get into the psychedelic space, and also looking for any reasons people might want to be screened out, etc. We also talk about facilitation, how IFS can be used as certain prompts for facilitating expanded states. And then we, obviously get into integration as well as difficult journeys, backlash, ab reactions to experiences, and looking all of that from a parts lens. So if somebody is, had a horrible journey, let's call it a bad trip, and they're freaking out and, they witnessed a whole bunch of stuff they never wanted to see, and they're just completely undone, that this happens for people sometimes. We want to look at that through a parts lens of like, oh, okay, what parts are reacting to this? Who is just in complete denial and overwhelm about whatever came up through the psychedelic experience? And there's a way to work with that can actually become really calming and help people to find their center again after some really, really difficult experiences like that. So, so we pretty much look at how IFS applies to every step of that process. And I also have a mentorship program now as well, where people who've taken these other courses can keep coming in for more practice. We do consultations with each other about anything that's happening in their personal experience. And a community is growing through that. So I'm really excited about that as well.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a nice balance between the theoretical information side, and then, as you said, you have these triads where people are actually going through the practice with you and with each other so that they're getting that practical application. How about on the psychedelic side? So this is kind of one of the questions around how we train people in doing various forms of psychedelic facilitation or therapy, but there's roadblocks, there's barriers to, okay, well, let's get together and do it. Yeah. So the way that is solved, say, through the Mindscape Institute where I teach, is that they're also organized as an entheogenic church. And therefore, students come and then they get an experiential week. That's not something I provide. I do not have a church. I'm just a teacher in the program. And then we also have some expectations like, well, if you're going to go through this facilitator training program, then you need to tell us what is your prior experience. That we're not getting somebody who's like, well, I just want, I want to have my first experience through this program. It's like, no, you've got to already have that. So how do you deal with that side? It's obviously, it's a lot easier to provide experiential practice with IFS than it necessarily is with psychedelics.
Definitely so. So one of the ways I've dealt with that is I've hosted retreats in other countries where there's a little more safety, and that's worked out okay. The trick with that is I find some people don't actually want to travel, and that actually surprised me. I thought, oh, well, everybody's going to want to go to Costa Rica, and then turns out like half the people I thought might want to go were like they didn't. So that's a little bit of a barrier to access. And so what I find is ultimately a lot of people are in other either facilitator programs. They may already be working in the underground on their own from other programs they're in, or just of their own independence. And so I actually have been doing a lot less with the psychedelic piece of it at this point, and really focus on the IFS piece itself. It's kind of like what you're doing where, you're entrusting that people are getting these experiences from some other avenue. I think I mentioned this earlier in the show today that I have a lot of students right now from entheogenic churches.
Yeah.
And so it's like they're under that umbrella and they're getting to go have lots of experiences under that space. And then they're learning the IFS over here. And so for me, it provides some safety as well of like, I get to teach you IFS, totally legal. And I trust that you're going to go incorporate this in other ways, in other spaces that they have access to.
Yeah. So
So,
something I noticed, looking at your website, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I saw somewhere that it said that the classes will not be recorded, and so you must attend the live class, this is an interesting way of approaching it, because as many classes have moved online, right, it allows the opportunity for people to participate from all around the world, and that a lot of people, I've done this as well, where you record the class and then you upload it so that anybody who missed it, they could go and watch it, or even students, if they want to go back and rewatch and like, oh, I want to see what we talked about, that maybe I spaced it, because that's another thing that's really easy to do online is, oh, I'm going to go over and cook a meal while class is happening.
yeah.
So what inspired that condition? Like, no, you're going to be here for the
You're gonna
class.
be
And
here.
how do you
Yeah.
find that works out at the practical level?
You know what's really cool? So I've been tempted multiple times to make it evergreen and just record it because it takes a lot of energy to teach live every
Yeah.
time. And even this week, I just started a new cohort of students 2 Mondays ago now. And I've actually already received the feedback from students saying, wow, I can't believe you're teaching this live every time. But I appreciate it so much because what happens is it creates this direct engagement with the students that's fresh every time.
Yeah.
And every conversation, there's different conversations that occur in each cohort, partially due to I think the people in this field keep maturing and growing. And so as I keep teaching it, we're having different conversations, right? Compared to when I started just a couple of years ago with this. And so I found that I'm hesitant to record it because I'm going to lose connection. And I really love the personal connect with all my students.
Yeah.
In fact, a couple semesters ago, I hired a couple extra assistants to help me out to do some of the practice groups. And in the end, I mean, energetically, it helped. I had a lot less work to do myself through hosting all those practice groups. But I realized at the end of the semester, I never got to know, it was, I don't know how, probably half the class because I wasn't in practice group with them. And I felt I was like, darn, like it was disappointing. I'm like, I want to know all those people.
Yeah.
So it's not, again, speaking back to the community, it's not just about teaching them. It's not just about this is my business and my livelihood at this point. And, like I actually love teaching and I love connecting with the students and I really have a heart for helping them get it. And so it's like, why would I do this if I'm not going to love it, And that's the part I love. So that's essentially what that's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you find that it is bringing in students from all over the place, or are they mostly Americans? Like, what's your demographic, do you feel?
Definitely the majority are from the US. I definitely, though, just this past week led a workshop and I had somebody from the UK who was there. I had a woman from Bulgaria attend one of my classes recently. So I do have a spattering of people who come from other countries. But I would say for the most part, it's definitely a US based group. But I do get people from all time zones. I mean, I always have people, Pacific Coast and across the US. So.
Yeah. Yeah. That can be difficult to juggle sometimes, especially with students who might be in Europe or elsewhere. It's a pretty big time difference.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And do you ever get people who come in and there's like, well, I just want the psychedelic therapy. What's this IFS stuff?
Not typically.
Yeah.
Most people who come are already a bit advanced in terms of, and that's kind of my preference is to work with more advanced folks. So people typically have like been turned on to this idea of parts work, and they're actually really excited to learn more about IFS. They may have already been doing their own personal therapy that way for years. They may have been told by other colleagues how amazingly well this works with expanded states. So usually people who find me are chomping at the bit to learn IFS. So yeah, they're not usually like wishy-washy about that part.
Oh, great. Do you know if you have any, I don't know if competitors is the right word, but are there other people offering similar programs that you're aware of, or is this, do you think it's fundamentally rather unique at this point?
Well, there are several other small schools who are teaching IFS outside of the IFS Institute. So the IFS Institute is the official place to get credentialed and all that. But I do know of 2 or 3 coaching programs who are teaching IFS for specifically for coaches and for them to get their CEUs and all that sort of thing for their coaching career in IFS. And I also know there's a few other people who do train in workshops on IFS and psychedelics. So there's a few other programs that are doing that. So, I mean, I think you could call it competitor. I've been seeing it through the lens of like, you can't hear the model enough. I feel like the repetition of hearing it multiple different ways from lots of different people is really helpful. It was actually one of the ways I learned IFS so well is I ended up doing all the trainings that they offer at the Institute. And then I started being a program assistant. And so then I was going as an assistant and rehearing it all from all different trainers. And it was really powerful. So yes, there are competitors, and a lot of students who take my class take their class, and their class take my class. And it's like, cool, plenty to share.
Yeah. So it's a collaborative ecosystem. So not necessarily competitors, but kind of working on towards the same goal, but offering different lenses, different opportunities, and yes, repetition. Oh my goodness. That's a big part of being a teacher is you got to repeat stuff. And sometimes I know as a teacher, sometimes I feel like, I'm just repeating myself. But then you still get a student who they seem to be hearing it for the first time. It's like, I've already talked about this in like 5 other classes, but okay, I'm glad it landed this time. And you got to keep going,
glad you got that.
keep going back to it. So I think we've talked about most of it, but what are the specific classes? What's the curriculum schedule? If people they want to find out more, obviously they can go to moxieschool.com, but what's coming up in terms of what you are offering and how people can get involved? And just to remind people again, it's MOXIE, Moxie, the old-fashioned word with the little vim and vigor, right? Moxieschool.com.
Yeah. So I work on a trimester basis, which I'm loving. So my cohorts go January, February, March. We're off for April, back on for May, June, July, and then we'll start our 3rd semester of this 2025 in September. So we'll be doing Art of Transformation, Art of Guiding, and another True Essence program. New students can enroll for that starting in September. And I'll have everybody graduated before the holidays start. So, and pretty much I kind of just go on this, ongoing rolling enrollment as people are ready to sign up. There will be another round coming each trimester. So yeah. And you can go to the website, moxieschool.com, and all the information should be there. If you ever want to reach out, I'm more than happy to set up a consultation sort of discovery call, answer questions. Sometimes people are curious, like, am I appropriate for this class or that class, or where do I fit in, or that type of thing. So more than happy to have one-on-one chats with people.
Okay, awesome. Well, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you feel like, we've got to be sure and mention this before we sign off?
I will say this. I really do believe, this is so beautiful. IFS is totally sufficient in and of itself as a transformational model. And I also believe that psychedelics are also completely sufficient in and of themselves for all the miracles that they can provide. And then them coming together is just I'm going to use the word marriage. I did a conference talk once on the divine marriage of I think it was MDMA and IFS. And it's true. It's like, it's the ideal. If you had 2 people getting married, the hope is that you're each interdependently healthy and whole and full and whole within yourselves. And I feel like both of these ways of working are. And so giving full credit to psychedelics for all that they are and full credit to IFS for all it is, and then the beauty that they create when they come together. So I'll leave people with that today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Heather, and for sharing all of this. And I just want to give another shout out to my patron, and I don't want to name the person in case they don't want to be named, but for making the connection and bringing this interview into fruition through that mutual connection that we have. And it sounds like the work that's happening at Moxie School is really fascinating. I'm really enjoying getting the opportunity to learn more about IFS. As I've mentioned, it's just coming up more and more with my own clients. So I like to hear about it from people who are involved in it and who know really what the relationship is with psychedelic therapy and psychedelic experience. So I feel it's been a learning opportunity for me, hopefully a learning opportunity for the audience here. And just want to encourage people, if you want more, check out moxieschool.com with Heather. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you.